Hello everyone and welcome to IR Geopolitical Analysis. Today is July 26, 2026, and we are analyzing Flashpoint 2026, the U.S. Iran blockade, choke points, and the global fallout. Now let's get started with the topic of discussion today. We will be examining the recent pause in airstrikes, a potential pivot in global power, and the underlying economics of global choke points. Let's start with a situation report on why this matters right now. After a 13-day bombardment, we are finally seeing a pause. July 25th marked the first night without new CENTCOM strikes on Iran since the Memorandum of Understanding collapsed. However, the U.S. naval blockade has been reimposed. After the initial April to June blockade was lifted, it is now back in force as of July 14th. We are also witnessing a dual-chokepoint disruption. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz is severely curtailed, and the Houthis have effectively closed the Bab el-Mandeb Strait to a significant amount of shipping. The political stakes here are incredibly high, as all of this is unfolding just months before the November 2026 U.S. midterm elections. What looks like military de-escalation on the surface is actually masking an unprecedented economic siege right on the eve of those midterms. To understand how we got here, we need to trace the path to kinetic conflict. It began in 2018 when the U.S. exited the JCPOA, leading to the collapse of the nuclear deal. That ushered in the shadow war era from 2018 to 2025, defined by sanctions, cyber operations, and proxy skirmishes. Then, on February 28, 2026, direct strikes began, climaxing with the U.S. and Israeli strikes that killed Ayatollah Khamenei. From April to June of this year, we saw a blockade and a brief ceasefire, where a naval blockade was imposed and then lifted. But in July 2026, everything collapsed and escalated once again. The Memorandum of Understanding broke down, resulting in 13 days of renewed strikes. Ultimately, the collapse of strategic deterrence has turned a decade of shadow conflict into direct, state-on-state kinetic action. Now let's look at the strategic geography, specifically chokepoint geopolitics. On one side, we have the Strait of Hormuz, where roughly 25% of global seaborne oil trade and 20% of global LNG passed through before the war. On the other side is the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the gateway to the Suez Canal, where about 5 million barrels a day of Saudi oil normally transit. We are currently facing a dual strangulation scenario. Both choke points are disrupted simultaneously, which is a first in modern energy security terms. This exposes a massive vulnerability for Saudi Arabia. To the east, the Strait of Hormuz is compromised. To the west, the Bab el-Mandeb is a live fire zone. Riyadh is caught right between two hostile choke points, leaving its Vision 2030 diversification plan and its coastal energy infrastructure completely exposed on both flanks. This brings us to the southern front, focusing on the Houthi variable and Saudi retaliation. First, the Houthis struck Saudi oil facilities at Yanbu and Jizan and severely damaged a Saudi vessel in the Red Sea. In response, Saudi Arabia retaliated with airstrikes hitting the strategic port city of Hodeidah in Yemen. What this shows is that the proxy has become the primary. The Houthis are functioning as a core piece of Iran's regional defense architecture, not just a peripheral nuisance. Yemen has become the southern front. By drawing Saudi Arabia into a costly air war over Hodeidah, the Houthis are deliberately diluting the anti-Iran coalition's focus and resources. They are effectively weaponizing the geography of the Red Sea against Riyadh. So what do we make of this current operational pause? Is it a true de-escalation or just a window for rearming? There are two main ways to read this. The first reading is that this is a genuine off-ramp. Regional mediators are calling the halt a positive signal, pointing out that this is the first night without new CENTCOM strikes in nearly 2 weeks, and diplomatic channels, specifically the Oman and Qatar-style mediations, remain highly active. But the second reading is much more cynical. This is just a tactical breather. The naval blockade, which is the structural cause of the tension, stays fully in force. Furthermore, President Trump has floated the idea of a further massive attack if talks stall, and we have seen pauses that don't address root causes collapse before, just like they did between April and June. The overarching risk right now is that a single misstep by a rogue proxy commander could shatter this ceasefire overnight. We have to take a closer look at CENTCOM's naval blockade and its goal of economic strangulation. Looking at the timeline, the blockade was first imposed on Iranian ports on April 13th. It was temporarily lifted on May 29th following the U.S. and Iran Memorandum of Understanding, but was reimposed on July 14th when those talks collapsed. According to U.S. officials, the estimated cost to Iran is upwards of $500 million a day. Under international law, a blockade is considered an act of war. It is the ultimate tool of economic strangulation. Washington is betting that it can achieve its strategic aims through this economic asphyxiation rather than having to commit to ground combat. But blockades are extremely resource-intensive and require sustained naval dominance to enforce. More importantly, they put mounting pressure on the blockaded state to lash out as its domestic economy spirals out of control. In response to this, Iran leans on its asymmetric defense, widely known as the natural fortress strategy. A key element of this is the Zagros Mountains. Decades of extensive tunneling have buried Iran's missile arsenals, command centers, and nuclear facilities deep beneath layers of solid rock. Analysts frequently refer to Iran as a natural fortress, using its rugged geography as a massive force multiplier. These deeply buried assets can resist standard bunker-busting munitions, which severely limits the efficacy of U.S. air superiority alone. In fact, Iranian commentators have confidently argued that the country is fully prepared even for a ground invasion scenario. Back in Washington, domestic politics are colliding heavily with foreign policy. The calculus comes down to gas prices versus the political clock. Gas prices peaked at $4.56 a gallon in early May. They eased after the June ceasefire, but climbed right back up with the renewed fighting in July. The November 2026 U.S. midterm elections are the undeniable political backdrop to every single strike decision being made. President Trump is simultaneously threatening further strikes while pushing for renewed talks. He has publicly brushed off concerns that rising gas prices could hurt Republicans this November, banking on the fact that conflicts often trigger a rally round the flag effect, boosting support for the incumbent party. However, sustained inflation at the pump could very well override that patriotic bump as voters feel the financial strain. Adding to this complex picture is a major diplomatic wildcard: the Israeli variable, specifically Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's upcoming visit to Washington. This visit adds a significant layer of volatility to an already fragile pause. Remember, Israel launched this war alongside the U.S. on February 28th and views the Iranian threat as an existential issue, not merely a geopolitical puzzle to be managed. There are reports suggesting that Trump is seeking to link a U.S. and Saudi nuclear cooperation deal to tangible progress on Israeli and Saudi normalization. Netanyahu's visit could force a hardening of the U.S. stance simply to project allied unity, or it could severely complicate the delicate back-channel mediations that are currently keeping the airstrikes paused. The global economic reality of this conflict can be seen directly in the oil markets. As of July 25th, Brent crude fell by 4% and WTI by 3%, as the operational pause briefly eased the risk premium. However, prices remain far above their pre-war levels. Furthermore, the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve is currently at its lowest level since 1983. Before the war, roughly 20 million barrels a day flowed through the Strait of Hormuz. That flow is now severely curtailed. When you add it all up, nearly a quarter of the entire world's daily global oil consumption is directly exposed to these contested chokepoints. This places Saudi Arabia in an impossible position, caught entirely in the crossfire. Looking east, the Strait of Hormuz is compromised, giving Iran a massive leverage point that directly threatens Saudi export routes. Looking west, the Red Sea is a live-fire zone, where Houthi ballistic missiles govern the Bab el-Mandeb shipping lanes. All of this puts Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 at massive risk. His diversification plan requires stability and foreign investment, both of which evaporate in a regional war. Furthermore, Saudi Arabia faces severe infrastructure exposure. Their critical refineries and coastal desalination plants are highly vulnerable to drone swarms. It creates a stark paradox. Riyadh is entirely dependent on U.S. security guarantees, yet it is the one absorbing the actual physical damage of proxy retaliation. This leads us to a critical analysis. Did the United States miscalculate? The core premise behind the February strikes was that overwhelming kinetic force would trigger rapid deterrence. It appears the U.S. drastically underestimated the resilience of the Iran and Houthi axis. The U.S. military is built for conventional state-to-state dominance. It is not optimized for bombing decentralized militias, nor is it built for seamlessly blockading a mountainous, heavily sanctioned, and hardened nation over a long period. The resulting economic backlash from this strategy may end up hurting the West nearly as much as it hurts Tehran. Ultimately, this looks like a classic case of military hubris clashing with unforgiving geography. But to be fair, let's steelman the blockade strategy and look at the counter-perspective. Does it actually work? Proponents argue that the blockade effectively starves Iran's military apparatus of vital funding. However, historical precedent shows that blockades rarely produce swift political capitulation. Iran has spent decades building a robust resistance economy. They are experts in maritime smuggling, utilizing ghost fleets and facilitating gray market sales, most notably to China. There is also a major strategic risk here. Cornering a regime economically can completely remove its incentive for nuclear restraint, rapidly raising the risk of a push toward nuclear breakout. If this blockade becomes total and permanent, Tehran may well conclude that crossing the nuclear threshold is its last remaining deterrent against regime change. So, we have to read between the lines regarding this pause in fighting. Is the current diplomacy just a smokescreen? For the United States, a pause is incredibly useful. It allows time to reposition naval assets and secure highly vulnerable logistical supply lines throughout the Gulf. For Iran, the pause is equally beneficial. It provides essential time to repair damaged infrastructure and coordinate deeply with their proxy forces across Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. This forces us to ask a difficult question. Is the positive signal touted by regional mediators genuine, or is it merely political theater while both sides secretly prepare their domestic populations for a much longer, grinding war of attrition? Taking a step back, let's look at the macro implications, starting with global trade. Are we witnessing the end of globalized shipping? Rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope is quickly becoming the new normal for ships trying to avoid the Red Sea. If the Bab el-Mandeb Strait remains a contested war zone, shipping firms will permanently reroute, adding weeks to transit times for global goods. This means global freight insurance premiums are going to spike right alongside fuel costs. This represents a massive, structural blow to the concept of just-in-time global logistics. Ultimately, companies and nations are being pushed to aggressively regionalize their supply chains, moving manufacturing much closer to home to avoid these exact vulnerabilities. The second macro implication concerns the trajectory of U.S. foreign policy. Simply put, the long-discussed pivot to Asia is derailed. 3 successive administrations tried to refocus American power on containing a rising China, yet 2026 finds the U.S. heavily entangled in the Middle East once again. This creates a dangerous Indo-Pacific vacuum. Committing this level of naval resources to a Middle Eastern blockade leaves inevitable gaps in the Indo-Pacific theater. We are also seeing a rapid erosion of U.S. soft power. Unilateral blockades accelerate the desire of non-Western nations to completely bypass the U.S.-dominated financial system. Consequently, we are seeing the rise of multipolar blocs. Momentum is building fast for economic alternatives like BRICS, as the Global South aggressively hedges its bets against American unilateralism. The third major macro implication is a fundamental realignment of the Middle East. Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are having a stark realization. U.S. protection, while formidable, cannot stop a cheap drone swarm from completely paralyzing their domestic economies. Moving forward, you can expect these states to pursue independent, pragmatic security arrangements. This will potentially include forging closer ties with Beijing, specifically to leverage China's economic influence over Tehran. The old dream of a neatly normalized Middle East sitting comfortably under a single U.S. security umbrella is rapidly fading. The region is actively entering a new, multipolar era defined by raw, highly transactional geopolitics. To wrap up and summarize where we stand today. First, the current pause in airstrikes appears highly tactical, not strategic. Second, the reimposed naval blockade absolutely guarantees future friction. Third, the global economic ripples from these closed choke points are only going to compound over the coming months. And finally, the upcoming November U.S. elections may ultimately dictate the outcome here. Washington is playing a very dangerous game of economic chicken, betting that the Iranian regime will break before the Western consumer does. That brings us to the end of this deep dive, so I pass the questions to you. What is the ultimate U.S. endgame here? And can the global economy actually survive a permanently closed Red Sea? Please remember to like the video, subscribe to the IAWupsc channel, and most importantly, drop your theories and counterarguments in the comments below. Till then, please do take care of yourself.